I'm Marcy Kahn, Chair of the New York City Bar's Task Force on the Rule of Law, and I welcome you to this important program on how we, as members of the legal profession, can and must protect our elections now, during the midterms, and beyond. We have cast this program as an urgent call to the bar because of the enormous challenges to our democracy, from the rise since the 2020 elections of both voter suppression measures and tactics, and also in strategies designed to subvert the choices voters actually make. The alarming increase in threats against election workers, as well as the proliferation of fact-free claims of fraud, have diminished public confidence in the sanctity of our elections and actually discourage people from voting. These developments undermine the very foundation of our democracy. We at the Rule of Law Task Force and at the City Bar have launched our Election Protection Initiative, of which tonight's program is a part, because we believe members of the bar are guardians of our liberty and that lawyers and law students have a singular role to play in preserving our freedoms, and indeed have an imperative to do so. If we don't protect the rule of law, who will? This initiative is nonpartisan, as is our program tonight, which includes leading voices on election protection from both major political parties. These issues should concern all of us who place our faith in the continuation of our constitutional democracy. We suspect that many here tonight share these concerns, but do not know what to do. Living in New York, how can we protect elections elsewhere in the country? We intend to provide answers to that question this evening, and as we continue our election protection initiative. As you will learn, there are many opportunities to help before, during, and after the elections, whether you have any background in election law or not, and whether or not you were able to travel to another state. I would like to thank the task force members who contributed to planning tonight's program, initiative chairs Steve Cass and Jennifer Rogers, and subcommittee members Jerry Goldfeder, Jim Silkenat, and Judge James LaPrest, as well as our intrepid City Bar staff members, Eric Friedman and Maria Salenti. Thanks too to the Election Law Committee and its chair, Rachel Harding, for co-sponsoring tonight's program and this initiative. And we could not have moved forward without the inspired leadership of our association president, Susan Kohlmann, who has broken new ground in our association's partnering with the American Bar Association in this initiative, and from whom we will hear in just a moment. We are extremely fortunate to be able to hear this evening from 4 leaders in our profession who have had extensive experience in creating pathways for lawyers and law students to roll up our sleeves and join the fight to preserve free and fair elections. Speaking as co-chairs of the Election Official Legal Defense Network will be Ben Ginsberg and Bob Bauer. Ben Ginsberg has represented 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees. His clients have included political parties, political campaigns, members of Congress and state legislatures, PACs, governors, vendors, and donors. He served as co-chair of the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which produced a much-lauded report on best practices and recommendations for state and local officials to make U.S. elections run better. Ben is a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and a lecturer in law at Stanford Law School. Bob Bauer is professor of practice and distinguished scholar in residence at New York University School of Law and co-director of NYU Law's Legislative and Regulatory Process Clinic. He served as White House counsel to President Obama from 2009 to 2011. In 2013, the president named him to be co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, along with Ben Ginsberg. In 2020, 21, President Biden named him to be co-chair of the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Our speakers from the American Bar Association will be Jason Kahne and Estelle Rogers. Jason Kahne is the current chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law. He advises individuals, entities, and government agencies on complex election law, campaign finance, political disclosure, and conflict of interest matters. His area of expertise is in the corporate and regulated community, including as counsel and treasurer to political action committees, advocacy groups, social welfare organizations, independent expenditure committees, and ballot measures on topics ranging from land use restrictions to government reform. He is a past president of the California Political Attorneys Association and a member of the Council on Governmental Ethics Laws. Estelle Rogers is immediate past chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law, is a retired public interest lawyer, and was most recently a nonpartisan voting rights lawyer. She has regularly participated in voter protection activities around the country. She is currently on the board of Lawyers Defending American Democracy, a nonpartisan organization devoted to encouraging the legal profession to stand up for our democracy and to hold to account those who have flouted the rule of law and their ethical obligations as attorneys. Estelle has been active in the ABA for many years, including 27 years in its policymaking House of Delegates and chairing several ABA committees. Our moderator this evening is Task Force member Jerry Goldfeder. Jerry is special counsel at Stroock and director of the Fordham Law School Voting Rights and Democracy Project. He also serves as advisor to the ABA Election Law Committee. As for logistics, our format for this evening's program will be that after we hear from each of our speakers, they will take your questions. The Zoom format, chat function rather, is disabled, but you can type your questions into the Q&A function by clicking the tab at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to get as many of your questions answered as time permits. All members of the audience will be muted during the program, and the program will be recorded and accessible on our website. It is now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to the leader of City Bar's Election Protection Initiative, Association President Susan Kohlmann, for some introductory remarks and the launch of tonight's program. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marcy. I want to thank you and the task force on the rule of law for putting together this critically important program. And thank you all for the incredible work that the task force has done in recent years. And thank you also to the Election Law Committee for co-sponsoring this program and for partnering so effectively with the task force on so many initiatives. And huge thanks to our wonderful distinguished panel and to everyone tuning in. As we turn this over to our panelists to talk about how lawyers can protect elections, I want to emphasize that this is a non-partisan gathering for a non-partisan purpose, defending the integrity of our elections. The proof is in the panel. Ben Ginsberg and Bob Bauer, as you just heard, are famous for representing respectively Republican and Democratic candidates in prior elections. And our two colleagues from the American Bar Association also happen to be from opposite sides of the traditional political spectrum. Jason Kahne, a conservative Republican, and Estelle Rogers, a liberal Democrat. Just like our esteemed panelists who you will hear from, I believe we need the talents of every lawyer and ideally the legal profession as a whole to stand as one to protect our elections. While I recognize elections are inherently political, we are not focused on outcome. We are focused on our electoral system, and it is protecting that system or process that is so fundamental to our democracy and the rule of law. I recognize that some lawyers, even some of our own well-respected members, don't want to get involved because they believe this involves politics. We also hear from other bar associations whose leadership is seeking advice on speaking out and taking action, but are concerned that they'll be seen by their members as acting in a partisan manner. I hope they will reconsider after hearing today's panel, because we're talking about protecting our system of elections, not looking for elections to come out a particular way. It is the serious threats to our elections that brings us here today. And as one of the world's best recognized democracies, I think we are just not wired to consider that our democracy could fail. But we must be realistic and realize that failure could happen here. And history will rightfully ask, where were the lawyers? So I hope we can all convince our colleagues and friends to join us in this election protection effort. Again, we're not concerned with anyone's particular party or political affiliation, only with developments that either threaten or protect free and fair elections. Free and fair elections are how the consent of the governed is determined, how the rule of law is sustained, and how democracy itself is protected. We, as lawyers, as officers of the court, and stewards of the legal profession, are obliged to honor our oath to protect the Constitution by taking action to protect our elections. Let's do this together. And with that, I am pleased to turn the proceedings over to our moderator. As you heard, one of our foremost election law experts and the director of the Fordham Law School Voting Rights and Democracy Project, Jerry Goldfeder. Jerry, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a privilege. Did I unmute myself? Yes. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be with all of you tonight, and to welcome everyone who's tuning in now and who will see it as on a later date in that this is being recorded. Look, it's very clear that the state of our union is fraught, is fragile. Our constitutional democracy is at a point in 2022 today that we have not been in many years since the end of the Civil War. We've had 59 presidential elections. 11 times a president ran for re-election and was defeated. 11 times. Only once did a defeated president decide that he was not going to go peacefully into the night and to subvert, to try to overthrow the election results. And we're living with that today. And it's not just the presidential election, but there are laws that have been passed that restrict voting rights, that increase the role of partisans in determining who won in a particular state. There's a variety of issues that make our constitutional democracy at risk. So let's drill down. What are we supposed to do about it? Almost every day someone says to me, we're going to be all right, aren't we? But it's a plea. It's a plaintiff question as to what should we do. We have terrific people with us tonight. So tell us, what should we do? What should those of us in the legal profession who play such a significant role, a critical role in maintaining the rule of law and the norms that sustain it, what role should we be playing? We're going to start with Ben.
Good evening, and thank you, Jerry, Susan, and Marcy, for the kind introduction to the New York Bar, for allowing me and Bob to discuss those very important and troubling issues with you. What I'd like to do is give you an assessment of where we are now and a little bit of the history of why Bob and I decided to form the Election Officials Legal Defense Network. And Bob will describe our specific programs in ways that we hope all of you will be able to help us. Both Bob and I have spent our careers in partisan elections, always on the other side of the table from each other, beginning in a long forgotten U.S. House of Representatives recount in 1982, and really continuing through and up to 2020. In 2012, I represented the Romney campaign. Bob represented the Obama campaign. And again, despite our differences in clients, we were always able to talk and always believed that the system of government that we had in elections could be improved. In 2012, 2013, Bob came to me and said President Obama wanted to form a commission, the Commission on Presidential Election Administration, to go over ways that voting would be better for all people who were entitled to vote. And so I was grateful for that opportunity. And Bob and I spent a year doing a deep dive into election administration and talking to election officials and coming to understand in a way I think neither of us had before the important and crucial job that they do. That's why the attacks on our democracy, the fairness of our elections, the validity of the results, the ultimate harm to the peaceful transfer of power that undergirds the democracy has been so troubling to us, because many of those attacks also included attacks on the very elections officials we got to know and came to respect. So EOLDN was a product of our desire to be able to help election administrators in their jobs when they were under attack, and really in the much bigger picture, to look at our elections and the fissures in our society today and see how we might be able to make the situation better. And those are the programs that Bob will describe to you. We do think that what happens in the 2022 and 2024 elections is really pivotal for the democracy and the country. And we think that based on our experience in politics and elections and election administration, that it's an important task for all of us, but especially for lawyers who do believe in the rule of law, to become engaged in that. As for where things are right now and why this work is so important, we start with the basic assumption that the current polarized, bitter situation is just not sustainable for a democracy. The recipe for unrest that's currently being brewed right now is bad for our democracy and bad for our communities. If people don't believe that the leaders that they've chosen have been chosen fairly, then that's a long-term and deep problem. As a Republican, I'm particularly sensitive to this. Every cycle in those 38 years I practiced law, I did election day operations. We always looked for fraud and irregularities in the polling place. That helps to provide credibility to the result. And we always feared that there would be some of the mischief we knew and learned about in Tammany Hall days, but you have to be honest about the evidence, and we never found it. The fact that we never found the evidence to sustain the charges currently being made about our election is really part of what animates us, concerns us, and should get all of you involved. I did a report with some other conservatives, 3 terrific retired Republican justices, Griffith, Ludick, and McConnell, Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General, a report by conservatives looking at all the cases brought post-election in 2020 to see if there was indeed any evidence of fraud. And we found that none of those charges were in the least bit sustainable. That is a problem if there is now a constant assault on our institutions for being inactive. But, and we have a problem we need to be awfully concerned about, which is 30% of the country doesn't have faith in our election. That part is not sustainable. 60% of it may be Republicans, but recent polling shows that there are concerns among Democrats as well about the validity of elections. And The real test of a democracy is do you accept the results if your candidate loses? And I'd ask all of you to suspend disbelief and certainly your desires for a moment and imagine Donald Trump running in 2024 and winning. And would another segment of the country then start rejecting the results as something that was impossible? In other words, we are at a position now, a station now, where we need to see if the toothpaste can be put back in the tube. There are many election deniers who were on the ballot in 2022. That will be a referendum and probably a test for Donald Trump on whether he runs in 2024. If election deniers win office, what does that mean for the administration of our elections and how fair they'll be? The other part that needs to be confronted is that for the past 22 months, there has been a sustained and laudatory effort to call out the fact that the election was not stolen or rigged. Yet that 30% number of people who don't believe in the results has not budged over the past 22, 23 months, which tells us just how polarized the society we're in and how poisonous the national environment is. So what to do about it? Well, the strength of the United States has always been in our local communities. The national atmosphere today is poisonous, and Bob and I, through EOLDN, believe that attacking this problem of election denial and disbelief really needs to take place at a local level in the most contentious ground zeros around the country. And that's what our specific programs are based on. And let me turn it over to Bob to describe those for you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you again for the New York City Bar's invitation for us to participate in the program. Ben has very well outlined why we came together to build the Election Official Legal Defense Network. And I would add only this, which is that when we worked on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, we wound up producing a report for the president, which was delivered in 2013, actually 2014. And in that report, we talked about the professionalization of elections and the steps that the country had taken toward professionalized election administration, toward modernizing and making for the voters the best possible voting experience. And we thought we were on that course. And now we're facing the possibility that that course is being completely reversed. And as Ben pointed out, we are witnessing a politics that is directed toward undermining faith in the elections, and a politics that in the course of doing this is putting election administrators under enormous and unprecedented pressures. So our programs are intended to vindicate the professionalism that we've observed in election administrators around the country at the state and local level, Democrats or Republicans, and to protect them from a range of threats, which range from personal threats to completely unjustified attacks by the political leadership in the state on their competence and on their integrity. Our program consists of the following. First, we have recruited hundreds of lawyers around the country who are prepared to provide to election officials pro bono legal services. Those officials may well want to consult somebody when they face a threat, whether it's of a personal nature, from political partisans, wherever they may be located. The lawyers involved undertake, to provide this on an attorney-client privilege basis, again on a pro bono basis. We provide the match after vetting the attorneys and putting them in our database, and the attorneys in question then have a direct relationship with the election official. We've already received requests, we've already made the matches, and some of this occurred much earlier than we anticipated that it would. Now, of course, for election officials in particular jurisdictions, we're looking to pair them with lawyers in that jurisdiction licensed to practice. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute in addressing lawyers who are licensed to practice in New York. But we have them around the country. And I want to come back to the role that I think lawyers in New York can play, even if the issue in question does not arise in the state of New York. The second program that we have that Ben certainly laid the groundwork for my telling you about is our Pillars of the Community program. And there we are going into communities and we are seeking to rally business, faith, and other community leaders not to become involved in partisan politics, disputes over voting policy that are typical between the two political parties, but the defense of fundamental guardrails, fundamental norms and institutions, like the norms that Jerry Goldfeder referred to in introducing us. And there, these communities have a special role to play because voters who are hearing election denialism in its various forms, and they're hearing back and forth between the two political parties, need to hear from those who they believe operate outside the political process and provide leadership to the community in other nonpartisan ways, but who will stand up for our democracy and our electoral process. Thirdly, we are also providing to election officials communication support. So as they deal with public controversies, which they've never faced before, whether under attack by partisans in the state legislature or in any number of other ways having to account for their actions publicly, we provide them with a pro bono communications assistance so that they can understand how to communicate effectively in that space in their own defense. Finally, we have recruited lawyers, law firms, again on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans, and we're in the process of doing this at this time, who are going to be readying themselves to look closely at challenges to laws that are intended to restrict or harass or rein in inappropriately election officials. Some of these laws have already been passed. They're intended to leave election officials in fear of criminal penalties, investigations for simply doing their jobs. In the words of one statute, for, quote, disregarding the object of the law, whatever that means. And these officials need to know that when these statutes are brought to bear in a way that's designed to disable the electoral process, we in the Election Official Legal Defense Network are prepared to act. So let me conclude by saying what it is among lawyers in your jurisdiction that you can do. First of all, obviously, we'll pair you with election officials in your jurisdiction who would like support. But secondly, we are going to need lawyers around the country who can support that last effort. The effort to look at legal strategies and develop responses to attacks on the electoral administrative process, on the nonpartisan electoral administrative process through legislation, through partisan directed quote unquote audits, and in other ways that are designed to impede that impartial administration of the electoral process. And we would also like to have lawyers around New York who can bring other lawyers around the country they work with on other matters into it, local counsel relationships they have, law firms that they do business with, that help us make sure that we have complete coverage all around the country for these purposes. So those programs, pairing election officials with legal support, with communication support, the communities program that we have, Pillar of the Communities program, and then the attempt to put up legal challenges where necessary to state legislative or regulatory attempts to intimidate officials. All of those are ones on which we need, as your president said at the very outset, urgent assistance in order for us to defend the people who day in and day out set up the electoral systems and administer the electoral systems that define who we are as a democratic nation. So again, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Bob. Before we move on to Jason and Estelle, one of the questions in the Q&A is whether or not the pro bono lists are still open, how they can get involved. So if you can be kind enough, if one of you can be kind enough to tell our viewing audience how they can be added to the pro bono list that you referred to, Bob, that would be good.
Certainly, you'll find at our website, our address is www.eoldn.org. And there you will find an online form that you can execute to bring you to our attention. And someone will be in touch with you to make sure that you're fully enrolled in the volunteer lawyer database. That's
great. And I think Eric has just put that in the chat for people to see. And I have one question before we move on, and that is Ben made mention of the fact that approximately 30% of Americans don't believe that Biden won. He didn't say it quite this way, but and the 30% figure has remained pretty steady. With all the work that the two of you and the many lawyers working with you have done, do you think that there's a role to play among your lawyers to help with the prosecution of those who threaten election workers, so that that kind of conduct is mitigated, if not eliminated, and whether or not your folks should also be involved in attempting to sanction lawyers who are involved in that untoward process of threatening election workers?
Well, every organization picks its mission, and our mission has not been to serve a prosecutorial function. We have spoken out publicly about the particular attempts against election administrators, and we'll continue to do that. But we don't have badges, and we're not prosecutors. On the sanctions issue, Bob and I may have slightly different views of this, but that's not the mission of EOLDN, is to get involved in these sanction cases.
Okay, thanks. There's also a question with regard to whether or not law students can be involved in your work. Can they be?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yes, I absolutely. I mean, we obviously, when we pair people, when we pair lawyers with individual election officials who have the need of that kind of support, we need licensed lawyers who can represent them as duly qualified lawyers in their jurisdiction. But there is going to be a lot of legal work to be done. I suspect we're going to find over the next several months very much the need to do what the program that I described to you is designed to do, and that is to answer very formal threats to the process, either regulatorily or legislatively enacted. And we would be glad to have the support of law students who are prepared to take up research and other tasks in support of that effort.
Or maybe the bar associations can facilitate that. So thanks very much. Jason and Estelle. Jason?
Well, thank you, Jerry. Before Estelle and I enter a dialogue about 5 ways that attorneys in New York and elsewhere can become involved in preserving the integrity of our elections, let me introduce the Standing Committee on Election Law a little further. The Standing Committee was created after another crisis of American democracy, after Watergate, and apropos of that era, was created to be purposely bipartisan and a standalone entity of election law experts connected across the bar, but focused on issues of elections. Ben and Bob have both alumni of this committee, and Jerry is a member of it. And in fact, in that role recently worked with bar attorneys on an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. So this committee has been around for a while, and it attempts to achieve its purpose through policy, programming, and initiatives. And we don't always agree and can't always agree, but we do work to find some common ground. So tonight, Estelle and I are going to talk a little bit about the work of the committee and the way it tries to facilitate lawyer involvement in elections through Poll Worker Esquire, an initiative, through its election administration guidelines, through programming, by partnering with other ABA initiatives. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about how you can be involved outside of the bar in different ways. So having introduced that, Estelle, why don't you share a little bit about Poll Worker Esquire, because it's your baby. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Never mind.
You're
Okay,
good. You're good.
okay. I wish I could take credit for the idea, but actually what happened was 2 years ago or so, the National Association of Secretaries of State came to the ABA and said, we really need a new infusion of election officials and poll workers, that is, and would like to ask the ABA if they could be of help with that. And the idea was that NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State, and NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, were going to partner with the ABA to encourage lawyers to become poll workers, lawyers and law students, to become poll workers, and to give them the tools that they need and the ability to connect with the right people in their jurisdiction. Unlike a lot of other election activities, by the way, poll workers generally have to be a resident of the state in which they're working. Poll workers are the ones who are actually become public officials for a day or the days of early voting or whatever. They are not partisans. They are not observers. They are the ones who check you in basically when you arrive and try to help people to navigate the voting system. So it's my baby partly because I gave it the name, Poll Worker Esquire, which people liked. And we were very successful last election in recruiting people to become poll workers who were members of the ABA and others and law students. And NAS and NASED were very eager to do it again. When it first started, really part of what was happening and part of the reason that NAS found it sort of urgent need was COVID, that a lot of poll workers traditionally who had done this for many, many years are older people, as they have been for years, and were particularly concerned about being in that kind of environment when there was so much contagion going around. There are other, I mean, just the aging of the poll worker population is another independent reason, with or without a pandemic. But since then, as Ben and Bob made clear, the issue of danger and threats add a whole new dimension to this, that a lot of people, particularly older people, who have been used to being poll workers every election for 20, 30 years, some of them have had second thoughts, and not surprisingly, there's even a greater need for new poll workers this time. So we are advertising this. I think the link to Poll Worker Esquire should be in the chat. Is it in the chat, Eric? No?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. And it's also, I think, on the New York City Bar webpage about election issues. And Marcy is nodding her head, so I guess that's true too. Speaking of which, I neglected to say that I'm very pleased to be involved in this program, and I'm very pleased that the New York City Bar is doing so much activist work in making sure on a nonpartisan basis that lawyers are doing their part in preserving and protecting elections.
And
Jason?
Estelle, I
So
think,
Estelle, just before you move on, while it's in our head, you talked about the poll worker program, and you mentioned correctly, of course, that in most states, if not all states, you have to be a resident in order to be a poll worker. So how do people in New York, for example, become poll workers in Ohio and Arizona and Pennsylvania? How does that work?
They don't. But at least I've never heard of an exception to this. You can become a poll watcher. You can do all sorts of other work, and we'll discuss some of those in a minute. Poll workers are generally, as far as I know, the people who reside in the jurisdiction. But let's be clear about something. Every state probably needs poll workers. So it's not just that your state is reliably one party or another, that or unreliably one party or another, that makes poll workers necessary. Every state will need more poll workers as the population of poll workers ages, and as there are people who just don't find it worth the hassle right now in this political environment. So, don't think that, you have to live in Arizona to make a worthwhile contribution as a poll worker.
And Estelle, before we move on, I think one of our pleas to New York and a focus of our committee going forward with the program is the ability to earn CLE credit. There are states, Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, Florida, Virginia, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Nebraska that provide CLE credit either for the training to be a poll worker or for serving. So that's something this committee is going to look further into, and maybe we should partner with the New York Bar on.
And let me mention that that list of states is an exponential increase over 2 years ago. I think there were maybe 2 or 3. So this is also something that we've been encouraging the ABA network of state and local bars to push for CLE credit and firm pro bono credit. I mean, there are ways that people can be persuaded to do this in addition to its being their civic duty.
Well, our next topic, one of the hallmark projects of our committee are election administrative guidelines that we have collectively and accretively over time put together. Estelle, why don't you describe the guidelines a little bit, and I'm going to explain some of the changes we made in this last year.
Thanks, Jason. I think that the guidelines, I believe I'm right, that started after the 2000 election, when we all know that there were some glitches that people had never seen before or weren't aware of, at least. And all of a sudden people started having some doubts that things were being conducted properly. And we decided, the committee, that I was not yet on then, but decided that it would be a great time for the legal community and the experts on election issues to promulgate a set of standards, or sort of best practices, if you will, on how to run an election in a very concrete sense, like, how many machines you should have per population, or what happens when you need to change a polling place. But also, I think over the years, and we've modified them several different times, there have been issues that have come to light. The most recent, and I guess Jason's probably going to talk about this, the most recent, of course, being the issue of poll worker safety and voters' safety in a difficult political environment. So it's a growing document. It's a living constitution. I wish it were more mandatory than it is. It is something that the ABA sort of sends out to the states and says, here's what we think, is the best way to run things. We hope you agree and make modifications accordingly. And I think that's the context, and it covers a wide variety of issues and is many pages long. And you can find it on the ABA website, actually. You can find it, and it gets approved by the House of Delegates of the ABA every time we have new additions to it. So it is an ABA official document.
Yeah. It's many pages, and it has commentary because of course we're lawyers and we can't resist that. Bob and Ben would understand, while we're not a presidential commission, we just rely on experience and what happens in recent elections. So this past year, in that updated version, we addressed, as Estelle just said, personal security, making that a best practice. What do you do? Here in California, legislature just last week, the governor signed a bill that allows the private addresses of election workers on all levels to be shielded in the same way as district attorneys and others. So there are a number of different ways that personal security can be achieved. The other issue that we addressed was misinformation and disinformation in the electoral process. I appreciate what Susan said at the beginning. We're not engaged in this to change outcome, but truly election officials have a challenge when something just outwardly false about the process, the date, or the way things happen is said. What parameters do they have to respond? And so we tried to put together some best practices and guidelines on that. So those are our election administrative guidelines. Next, we wanted to talk about programming. And Estelle, I'll start on that one because, as you can appreciate from Estelle and my background and a group of people with different views around the table, we can't always agree.
But we don't sound too different, Jason. We sound really in sync. Let me just say this, because I think when you introduce the committee, this is,
Yeah.
we think, the only committee in the entire ABA, and there are hundreds of them, believe me, where it is sort of by constitutional dictates, half Democrats and half Republicans, and the chairmanship switches between Democrat and Republican each term. So we are, we're by design bipartisan, and we work together generally very well because we all have a mutual admiration for good elections, and don't see a great party divide on that.
There we go. And for each other, even though Estelle often calls me her favorite Republican. And
You
as I
are.
said to this group, I just don't know if that's an insult or a compliment. But I go with it. So because you have those different views, sometimes we can't agree on policy to advance it or approve it by another section. But what we can do is programming that deeply explores an issue. And as soon as you go deeper into an issue, you realize the old partisan divides aren't always there. And let me give a couple examples. All you vote by mail. Obviously, this is a change made after the pandemic. Obviously, there are partisan differences viewing whether that's meant to or does advantage one side or the other. But the reality is that's the law. And so we've had a series of programming about what are the impacts of that law. With the Native American Rights Fund, we talked about communities that don't have mailboxes, have to travel long distances and depend on traveling to places to vote. With the disability community, whose vote count went down in the last election because, again, they rely on help of election officials. And so we looked at online voting in Hawaii and the experience they had there. We've looked at gender parity in elections. Again, both sides may argue about the result, but the reality is in the laws, things need to change. We looked at campaign finance and whether childcare is covered as a legitimate campaign expense. We've looked at conflict of interest laws that rely on traditional, notions of the way a family and its finances work. So there are a lot of areas that need work. And so we're just encouraging you, we do many of these programs on CLA to get involved, to listen to the dialogue and advance some of these changes. Estelle, do you want to say anything about programming more?
Just that Jason's been the program chair while I was chair of the committee, and he does a terrific job. And there's some really, really wonderful programming that's been going on for the past few years, and I expect it'll be true in the next few.
Well, there you go. And those are archived. So take a look it's the ABA CLE site. A number of these are on there. Now, Estelle, the ABA does a lot of things, and a lot of different sections and divisions are working on democracy initiatives. Why not walk us through a few of them?
I'll give you a few, and there are probably a lot more than this. So
Yeah.
at the risk of, hopefully the chair of every ABA section is not listening to this because they'll probably be annoyed. But there are several ABA entities that right now have active programming going on, and there are others that probably do because in the past they have. The Senior Lawyers Division, for example, of the ABA has for many years encouraged senior lawyers to become poll workers because many of them are retired and have the time to do it. And we all think that lawyer skills are very good in the context of a polling place, especially when you have to navigate challenges and that kind of thing, which is probably, if anything, going to become more common. So that, that's one that's less well known. This section of civil rights and social justice in the ABA has, as you would expect, a lot of interest in voting rights and is currently engaged in something they're calling the Voting Rights Service Initiative. They actually got a quite generous grant for this work, and they've produced a voting rights toolkit and do trainings, and they have a lot of written materials for people who are interested in helping to do voter protection. And it is, and they're also encouraging people to volunteer with the Lawyers Committee's voting rights hotline, which if you aren't familiar with it, and I'm sure many people are, I think it's 1-866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE. And it's been in existence for quite some time. This is actually something that lawyers in any jurisdiction can do. I've been hearing rumors that they have too many lawyers, which is hard for me to believe. But, so give it a try. But they have people remotely helping, Floridians, let's say, from Washington, D.C. or from New York on the phone. If somebody has, a problem, and many of them are sort of fast breaking things that, they're at a polling place and, all the machines shut down all of a sudden and people call that number. They probably call a bunch of different numbers, but that's one. And that's a great thing for lawyers to get involved in, regardless of where they live. And again, regardless of whether they're actual voting experts, because you get trained, you have materials in front of you. I've sort of done this in jurisdictions that I never went to other than working on an election. And if you get well trained, and if you have the election law, which is, any lawyer can look up Florida election code, and it's a lot more coherent than you might expect. So that's another thing, another area in the ABA that is doing work on elections this time. So that's the civil rights and social justice section, and that should be on your the website for that should be on your chat as well.
It is.
Okay, great. Then the last one I'll mention is the ABA Governmental Affairs Office, which is sort of the lobbying office of the ABA, has an election center, which also should be on the chat. And it assists individuals in registering and updating registration. This is a more grassroots help kind of thing. And I think they would appreciate help from lawyers too, as volunteers. So I think that all of this goes to show that there are many niches that lawyers can fill, and that their training is, I think, particularly appropriate for this kind of work. Back to you, Jason.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I want to return the compliment to Estelle, who's, you can imagine the ABA as a large organization has worked hard to try to bring these resources together and have them complement. So our last topic is other ways lawyers can be involved with the qualities that Estelle just described. And I'll start because I'm on a local elected K-8 school board. Yeah, through COVID. I appreciate what Ben said earlier about being at ground zero. But that's important for lawyers to think about, getting involved themselves as elected officials, because I think what Ben and Bob have said is right. It's on the local level that we can see democracy work, and it's lawyers who can bring the skills of being able to have, confrontation, but still come to a result. So I'll make a pitch to think about local office. Look at your city or county and school board. You might just be a mom or a dad like me, and it can be rewarding. Although, if you really want to do it, call me, because there are other things to know too.
Let me mention a couple of other things that strike me. First, I wanted to, Jerry asked a question of Ben and Bob earlier about the use of lawyers to prosecute or sanction other lawyers who attempt to subvert elections or tell lies to courts or whatever they may do that's not part of the ethics code. I just wanted to mention and make another pitch in my hat as a board member of Lawyers Defending American Democracy, because that's what it has been doing, is filing ethics complaints. And I think it's the counterpoint to asking us to encourage lawyers to do good work, is that there have been some obvious exceptions to that lawyers have not acquitted themselves well in recent years. And I think that we all have an obligation also to sort of monitor the profession and to keep it on the straight and narrow. And so I urge you to get involved in that work should these issues continue to come up. And also, and that's nonpartisan work as well. So let me just say that all of the things we've been talking about are nonpartisan work and should be. That they are people who are not showing up at polling places because they want to foreordain a result, but showing up because they want the system to be honest. And but there are partisan roles that one can play, and we are not urging it or sanctioning it. But if you wanted to do political work that is more partisan, there are those opportunities as well. in addition to polling, there are poll observers, as I mentioned, that's in contradistinction to poll workers. And they sometimes come from nonpartisan organizations. I was some years ago involved in a program they had in Ohio where lawyers were recruited to monitor on a nonpartisan basis as basically a service to the election officials. The election board trained these lawyers to sort of be around in Ohio polling places and in the central polling place to monitor whether there were things going wrong or people harassing other people or anything improper. And that was a totally nonpartisan effort, unusual, but nonpartisan. Then there are also other things where you can get involved with a campaign or a political party and volunteer to do work that way. That would not be poll workers. That would be poll observers or people who are outside electioneering beyond the statutory limit. And I think that we would be dishonest if we didn't mention that those are opportunities for lawyers as well. And many avail themselves of those opportunities and find it a very fulfilling experience, as all of these are. And I've done many of these roles. I've run the gamut, both partisan and nonpartisan. And you feel, you've done a really good day's work when you do it.
Yeah, and it's important to emphasize that the partisan work complements the nonpartisan work. Estelle and I were just in Portland, Oregon, observing their election office, the county election office. And one of the observations that stuck with me was the challenge of incorporating poll watchers, outsiders in the post-COVID era, and what an effort they've made to make sure that the process is accessible. And he was telling the story of both parties, and particularly the Republican Party, that had changed some leadership and there were election deniers among them. And he spent time with them, showing them the process. And, again, ground zero work. The parties do get involved and they're part of the system, and they get involved in a larger way too. The Republican Party recently filed suit in Arizona and Maricopa County about poll workers. And questioning whether they were significantly or sufficiently balanced between the parties. So, the parties play an important role on the right and the left of this process.
Thank you.
So, Jerry?
With regard to the issue of that you just addressed, Estelle, of poll watchers or poll observers, whether they're partisan or nonpartisan, I've had the privilege of training literally thousands of lawyers in a variety of states. Ben and Bob, in their respective roles as running in counsel to various presidential campaigns, have been on the top of the pyramid of all these kinds of activities in a partisan way. But for the people who are listening who may not be familiar with the nuts and bolts of what that really means, I think it would be useful if Ben and Bob and the others as well can address how a poll watcher, how a poll observer can actually facilitate the work of a poll worker so that the elections run more smoothly and more honestly, because they do complement each other. It's true there's a residency requirement, but given that, how can a poll watcher, what does a poll watcher do that helps the poll worker make certain that the poll worker is doing their job well and honestly and fairly? Bob, Ben, you want to address that?
Go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to start. So the responsibilities and the rights of poll workers and poll watchers really varies tremendously from state to state. So there is no one answer to that. And one thing that's incumbent on anybody who goes into a polling place is to actually know what their proper and permissible roles and responsibilities are in the job. But a volunteer who's in a polling place is an extra set of eyes.
Excuse me a second. I think we've lost your photo. I don't think we see you, Ben.
I see him.
No, he's in a thumbnail at the top.
It's at the top.
I think what we lost was the help we got from our IT person.
I'm sorry, I really didn't want to interrupt your very important remarks, but I want the people to see you.
Well, it's not such a tremendous benefit for anybody.
There
There
you
you
are.
go.
There you are. Okay.
I would beg to differ.
But what somebody who is volunteering to go into a polling place can do is be an extra set of eyes for the election official. And so if there are problems, my experience is that the elections officials really want to fix it and correct it. So a volunteer helping out in a polling place can really help to guide things. And what perhaps is their most important role is actually, at the end of the day, validating that there weren't problems in a polling place and that the election results were legitimate and there were no irregularities. If a poll worker, poll watcher does see an irregularity, it's incumbent on him or her to note that because that may become relevant in a post-election challenge. And if there is something that goes wrong, you really need the firsthand sort of sworn affidavit experience of the person in the polling place.
Thank you, Bob. Would you like to add anything to that, Bob?
No, I completely agree with there's been a lot of press recently about weaponized poll watchers. The whole idea that they're there to be part of an extension of the party struggle, the struggle between the two political parties. And in fact, as well trained and conceived, and Ben pointed this out when he said it really depends on the role, the poll watcher there is to assist in solving problems, identifying and solving problems. And yes, there's reassurance on the part of the party that it has its watchers present. Yes, they have a reporting function to their parties. And yes, it is certainly true that they can play a validating role, but properly trained, and Jerry, you know this better than anybody else. I don't think anybody has trained more poll watchers in the history in our world. They are also there to help solve problems for the benefit of the voters, all the voters who are in the polling place.
Let me mention something though, Bob, that's a bit different, which is that there is an actual program this year run by might as well just say it straight out, some Republican operatives that is designed to make poll watching a more aggressive form of political activity. And I think that challenges particularly are being designed to happen more frequently and with more ardor maybe than in the past. So I think we have to be aware that along with many other unfortunate developments of partisanship and threats of violence, et cetera, that this is another aspect of the more and more toxic environment we're in. I hope it doesn't really happen, but there is a training program apparently to make to have a more aggressive form of poll watching this year.
Let me push back. Let me push back on that a little bit. I think there is a distinction, a difference between the media reports you may have read about those programs and what the actual materials and even tape recordings of those sessions are. That they are not nearly as aggressive as you say. I think the press reports cause a sort of enhanced anxiety in polling places, which I think is really, really bad in terms of voter turnout. And to this point, you have not seen examples of there actually being challenges of the types you describe. And as someone who wants to see elections validated, I actually want both sides to get as many poll workers into the polling places as they can, because if they don't see any problems, then that validates the elections. And if they do see legitimate problems, then you got to fix it. And there are 10,000 jurisdictions in this country where there's voting. So each election in each polling place is not perfect. So the more eyes on it, the better. Now, if they go over a line and start making it difficult for voters to cast their ballots by disrupting the polling place, that's something totally different. But the sort of I think overhyped coverage of those training sessions is, if anything, going to dampen participation.
Well, so
Well, I
let's
appreciate that.
stipulate that we're not going to characterize anything as too aggressive or too hyper-partisan, but let's also stipulate that some people may unintentionally or perhaps on their own going rogue, go over the line. What does a poll watcher do about that?
There's usually a protocol where they first report any misbehavior they see to the poll worker, to the election official on duty. Beyond that, I think it varies quite a bit, as all of this stuff does. But they might report something. If it can't be resolved by the poll worker, then there may be a reporting structure up the line to the election office, to the Board of Elections. But again, it varies quite a bit.
It does vary from state to state. In New York, we have police at every polling station in New York City, and sheriffs and their deputies and agents, so on, upstate and in the suburbs. But they don't know the election law, and they're not there to do anything other than to look as if they're maintaining some kind of peace at the polling place. So I think that underscores, and of course every state is different in this regard, that underscores Estelle's point that there are election officials to whom reports should be in good faith made when something is observed that shouldn't be occurring.
Well,
There are also
the poll worker is also going to tell his or her political party or candidate
Right.
who they're there representing. And so that information.
no, but we're talking
The poll
nonpartisan.
worker.
But we're talking nonpartisan at
Well,
this.
you were talking about problems in polling places, and if
Yeah, but
there's
the poll
partisan
worker
there
is
will-
not. Sorry, Ben.
Well,
Go
the
ahead.
terminology varies from state to state. Some
Right.
places call them watchers, some call them workers. But yes, the nonpartisan ones report up that chain, but presumably there is also a representative of the political party there who will report up that chain, so it becomes part of an election contest if there is one.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, Ben, is that that's the role of the outside observers, is they're building a record, and the courts rarely are gonna get involved on election day unless it's an issue of keeping the polls open or whatnot. But that doesn't mean they can't afterward.
So the goal is not necessarily to build a record for post-election day litigation. The goal is to try to mitigate the problems. And that raises the issue as to whether or not you folks think it's useful to use lawyers and law students, whether they're litigators or not, in doing research and preparing templates of litigation before election day, before early voting, on statutory problems, on problems that are legal in nature, in order to enjoin the particular enforcement of statutes, or to enjoin a particular conduct that's threatened. My experience is that there are not-for-profit organizations that do go to court before election day, before early voting, and do set up templates of litigation in order to try to stop the problems before they start. I wonder if any of the four of you could address what role you think lawyers can play in this. And I don't know if Ben and Bob, if your organization gets involved with this kind of work. Do you?
Yeah, and just to be clear, when you say the kind of work involved in, just to be clear, so I can match it up to what we do.
Okay.
Can you clarify? I'm sorry, I just was not clear what kind of work are you referring to?
If you, I'm talking about pre-election day litigation. in order to get an opinion from a court and perhaps an injunction from a court with regard to a prospective conduct that would interfere with the election, whether it's because there's a law that's been passed that we believe goes further than it ought to, or because there's a threat to by a party that they're going to go beyond the law. Does your organization get involved in that kind of a pre-election day litigation?
So I think it's fair to say that our emphasis, though I mentioned as part of our program, is to develop litigation capability to address specific systemic threats to the ability of election officials to perform administratively. So there's a range of litigation we would not be involved in. And we all know there's a whole slew of causes of action and complaints that we can see in the election space. Ben, I think it's fair to say we are concerned with ones that are directed, again, institutionally at election officials and that are designed to put them under immediate threat or condition their behavior on compliance with partisan political demands that have nothing to do with professional administration. In the future, I suspect, I don't know that that'll happen between now and November 8th of 2022. We may be involved in that activity pre-election in the 2023 cycle. That is the focus that our litigation effort would have. Ben, I want to make sure you think I fairly stated that.
Yeah, I do. I think we are not going to step in the shoes of a political party with all the litigation that is brought pre-election, which inevitably blends about 100% with one party or another's turnout plan.
I was trying to be as general as I possibly could because this is a nonpartisan discussion. But I'll take an example where I don't think there would be too much disagreement. The law in Georgia that prohibits giving water or food to people on these long lines while they're waiting to go and vote. I take it that Ben and Bob, your organization would not get involved in challenging that law or trying to restrict the work of the poll workers to interfere with civilians giving water or pizza or what have you. But there are organizations that do that. And I wonder maybe if the ABA has been involved with this kind of work.
Jason, you know the answer to that? Because I don't think so.
No, I don't think we have. If it came to our committee, I think we'd have difficulty in grappling, even with that example, Jerry, that you tried to lay out in a nonpartisan way.
I tried to pick the most obvious,
non-controversial state.
nonpartisan example.
If they tried to stop poll workers from eating or drinking, we might become involved.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Fair
But
enough.
your point is well taken, Jerry, that, elections are highly litigated. And I think the country knows that more now, but this has been true for decades. And there are a lot of nuances that are going on, from what's in the ballot to what people call themselves on the ballot to what's happening up to election day to recounts and otherwise afterwards. So there's a lot of potential for lawyer involvement in elections.
Yeah, let me mention one other thing that, oh, sorry, Jason.
No, yeah.
One other thing that we haven't mentioned that is a good role for lawyers and nonpartisan or partisan is to having conferences, meetings with election officials before the election to say, this is what we're planning to do. And do you have anything that we can help you with? And how are you going to handle X problem or Y problem? And it's just sort of a nice way to keep those lines of communication flowing so that people don't have to run in all the time and say, you're doing this wrong, or you're unfairly helping one side rather than the other. There are things like that. One thing that sometimes doesn't happen, but is always supposed to, is that anybody in line at a polling place, when the polling place closes, is allowed to vote as long as they were in the line at that point. and it's not always adhered to. So that's the kind of basic question that you can ask in one of these pre-meetings that I also think would be great handled by lawyers, and they do it in nonpartisan organizations as well as the party people.
One of the questions we have on the Q&A is whether one needs to be a resident of a state in order to be a poll watcher, a poll observer.
I
It
think
depends
no.
on the state.
Yeah,
May depend on the state.
yeah. But it's certainly not an across the board prohibition. So it's a lot more of a possibility.
Now, I was just going to ask Bob if he had any concluding remarks, because I know he has to leave, but I think he's left. Bob? I missed it by a minute. I'm sorry about that. Bob Bauer always has a lot to say because of his great experience and his wisdom and his insight into the problems that we all face. So I think that we have addressed most of the questions.
Marcy flagged a particular question, Jerry, about how would you become a poll watcher in a battleground state. And
Okay.
again, one would have to check to make sure that if you're not a resident of that state, you can be a poll watcher. And then you decide whether you want to try to do something with a nonpartisan organization, or whether you want to get involved with a party or a candidate. So, there are lots of ways to do it. People often do. That's, a lot of the poll watching I have done over the years has been in battleground states on purpose for obvious reasons. And if you're interested in a particular candidate, you can call their volunteer coordinator and say, I'd like to come to Nevada, where I happen to be going. And what kind of help do you need? I'm a lawyer. I can do this, I can do that. And I've had experience. And, even if you haven't had experience, it's often a very attractive offer. So battleground states are no different from any others. You just decide, where you want to work and see if you can be helpful there.
So is there a place, a website where people can ascertain whether or not one needs to be a resident of a state in order to be a poll worker? We're assuming most states you do have to, but also a poll watcher. Is there a site that we can show people where to go?
I don't know of one site, but if you want to, if you have a state or a campaign you're interested in, the Secretary of State or the state election director's website would be, which has FAQs most of the time, would be a place. And or, call them. I mean, the good old fashioned direct way is often the best.
So we've talked a lot about various ways people can be involved, from being a litigator to doing research to just providing advice to actually going to a particular state or going on a hotline. And what I'd like to do is, if there are any concluding remarks or additional suggestions by any of the speakers, I'd welcome them at this point.
Well, I'll make one, Jerry, I was about to make, is that making a pitch for those websites. I said elections have been litigated for a long time. They have, but election law has gone through pretty dramatic change in the last years. A lot of state legislatures have acted, particularly, Estelle talked about the rule of waiting in line. Now with all mail voting, the rule about postmarking your ballot, how long it can, take to get to the election official. These rules have changed. They're typically on the website. And as lawyers in your community, take some time to brush up on that. People ask you as a lawyer about these rules. They've changed. And so I think I encourage all lawyers to understand the rules of their jurisdiction and how they've changed.
And I
Right.
just say we would certainly welcome the help in our efforts to protect election workers and election administrators. EOLDN.org is the website, and we would welcome your signing up and helping us.
Yeah, there are a lot of election issues that have been pretty constant over the years, and I think that what Ben and Bob have recognized is one very troubling new issue, and they're doing what good lawyers do, and that's to tackle it. So I urge you all to get involved in that.
And
Or
needless to say, the New York City Bar Association site, which should be put up on the chat now, has a variety of opportunities, specific organizations, specific opportunities for people to get involved. Be affirmative, take action. Understand that we are all in this and we do play a critical role. Is nothing less than our constitutional democracy at stake here. That's not an exaggeration. I think everybody watching appreciates that fact. We are in a very fragile time. Susan, Marcy,
Yes,
final
thank you.
thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if Susan wants to include any before I wrap up. Okay. But thank you to our fabulous speakers. We have learned so much from you this evening. And I want to extend our thanks on behalf of the Rule of Law Task Force. You've just been very inspiring. And Jerry, we thank you for leading our discussion this evening and sharing your expertise. I want to thank everybody in the audience for being with us this evening, who spent part of your evening with us. I am going to reiterate what you've already heard, that we have an election protection opportunities page on our website. It's in the chat, I think more than once, but I'm going to just read it off to you again. It's a great resource. It's bit.ly/3ROH And we have many opportunities there that we're some of which you've heard about tonight, but it's organic, and we are continuing to add to it about poll workers. We have the Cada Vota Cuenta Latino Justice that PearlDeaf is doing to help eligible voters who need Spanish speakers to help them vote. We have information hotlines, all these pro bono legal opportunities, including research opportunities. We also have, by the way, a pledge on voting and the rule of law that you can sign on our website. And we have reports on the consent of the governed, and we have a wonderful column written by President Kohlmann that is also very instructive, and I think you would like it. So that said, I agree that we in the legal profession must do everything we can to protect the rule of law. Do volunteer, whether it's with EOLDN or the ABA or any of these other organizations. Come out and do that. Let's be society's leaders in protecting the elections. Thank you all, and have a good evening.